Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well today. This time we are going to be looking at Doom Guy, Life in First Person by John Romero. This is the fourth book about id Software that I've read, and I think it's probably the best one out of all of them. So let's talk a little bit about John's life first. I didn't include that as a section in this because I felt like it was going to be a little bit too long, and I didn't really want to talk about it in this video. There's a lot of stuff that happens to John while he's growing up. There are a lot of very personal stories in here, and I think they do a really good job of explaining why John is the way he is, why he thinks the way he does. And yeah, he had a lot of life experiences growing up, and it helped him to just become the person that he is today. So let's jump ahead to really his time at Softdisk. He did a lot of work before he got there, and like a lot of other people around this time that were in the video game industry, he would make his own games, send them off to different magazines, and just try to get his name out there as he worked towards being in the video game industry. He had been making games for a very long time, and yeah, he was kind of self-taught in a lot of ways. He tried to go through college, but he wasn't put on the right career path, mostly because at that time, colleges didn't really understand what you were trying to do. So, yeah, in the 80s, there was a lot of growing pains with learning how to make video games and going to college to learn how to do that. So you had to really be self-taught. He wasn't in the right program right away, and that kind of hampered him a little bit. But then he just went back to what he was doing before and just learned on his own, which seemed to work out a whole lot better for him. He does eventually land a job at Origin, and he says he really wasn't all that happy there, or at least that's the impression that I got from it. He wasn't doing what he wanted to do, and he eventually left, formed a small startup for a little bit. That didn't really work out, and then he left that and went to work at a company called Softdisk that was down in Louisiana. They would compile programs, basically, onto disks and sell those to computer magazines. John started working there, and he was making games for them. Eventually, it turned into an actual not really a side project, but an actual project within Softdisk called Gamer's Edge. And he was able to basically gather together the team that would eventually become id Software. So you had Adrian Carmack, John Carmack, Tom Hall, and I'm going to mess up his name. Jay. I can't remember his last name right now. But those guys were all very important to founding id Software. Some of this is covered in a book called Masters of Doom, but they don't go into as much detail as John did. I think he covers a lot more of just what was going on at the time, and yes, it is from his perspective only, but he goes more in depth with what happened at Softdisk and also really the business side of id after they left Softdisk. Also, as a side note, he includes a way in order to, like a pronunciation guide for id, because apparently he's heard people call it ID, and I've never heard anyone call id Software that, so that was one thing in this that I found really entertaining. Eventually, the team that was working on Gamer's Edge at Softdisk, they leave and they form id Software. This happens because John Carmack and Tom Hall created kind of like a more smooth scrolling program for PC games. This might sound kind of weird for people today, but there was a time when you couldn't play Mario on a PC, not because the PC couldn't handle it or because nobody had cloned it over, but because you couldn't just scroll a level on a PC. I'm sure there were some computers that would let you do it, but at least at that time, it wasn't a piece of technology that could be done. It's kind of interesting to think about that, and I never really remember seeing games that would do this, but it's very hard to talk about. If you want to know what it did look like, or at least what some attempts to make a PC scroll or make a side-scrolling game on a PC would look like, you could check out some of the Nintendo games that Hudson Soft ported over. Those look and play an awful lot like the original Legend of Zelda, where you would just move to the side of a screen and then it would stop and the next screen would sort of like shift over. That's a little bit what it would look like. So this side-scrolling technology led them to start work on a game called Commander Keen, and this would be a series of games that were all shareware. This was a very interesting model, and it led them to kind of linking up with a publisher called Apogee. While working at Apogee, they were also still making games for Gamer's Edge, so these guys were turning out like a new game every month and then every 2 months, and they had multiple projects going. So these guys were always going in just almost like a breakneck pace. One might call it a crunch pace for an extended crunch where you're doing like 12 to 14 hour days. But John talks about how that didn't really matter to them, and they just wanted to keep making games. He also really does a great job of explaining the shareware method of distribution, and he calls it, or at least I considered it more like an episodic game, but he compares it more to today's free-to-play model, where you buy the base game or you get the base game for free, and then you can buy like the different episodes to it, like the different DLC that comes along to it, and that sort of thing. Similar to like how Fortnite is, where you get Fortnite for free now, and then you just get like the season passes and whatnot. It's not exactly the same, because with the shareware model, you would get the first part of a game, and then you'd have to call a number to get the rest of it. So, to stick with the Doom levels, or the Doom games, you'd play the first episode of Doom, you'd kill the 2 barons at the end, and then the game would just sort of like fade to nothingness. You'd get a wall of text that was like, well, it's not supposed to end this way. If you want to keep going, call this number and get the next episode. And a lot of people would do that, and it worked out really well. Or you could be like me and just have no idea what they were talking about and just play those levels and go, well, that's kind of a weird ending. So the story of what happened between Sierra Online and id isn't really all that interesting, at least probably not interesting to most people, but it was something that I was hoping would be in here. It's told in a few different places, and I read it in Masters of Doom, and then I also read it in Not All Fairy Tales Have Happy Endings by Ken Williams. That is the one that I was most interested in, because Ken Williams gives his account of his meeting with the id Software guys. And it did line up with what was going on in Masters of Doom, but it was better to have like a first-person perspective or a first-hand account of what was going on. That's why with this book, I was really interested in the story as well, because you have the same thing. You have a first-hand account of what happened at that meeting, but it's taking place from the other side of the table. So Ken Williams owns Sierra Online, and John Romero is one of the founders of id Software, and they both largely tell the same story. And that was kind of what I was hoping for. John does have a few different details that are a little bit different in his account, but that's just because Ken admits in his book, he doesn't really remember everything. Specifically, the Cody Award, where he apparently had a conversation with them, and they did mention that they talked about it, but he didn't really go into any detail because he didn't remember too much. John gives more details about it, but the story is largely the same. It just makes me happy that we have a full account of this. I'm not too sure if we had like the other people that were there, like Adrian Carmack or John Carmack or Tom Hall, if they would give a different account of this story. I'm sure it would probably be the exact same, or maybe they would have a different take on what was said or something like that. But overall, it's pretty much the same story, and it's just kind of cool for the id team to say, hey, you didn't want to buy us, or you didn't want to give us as much money as we were asking for, and hey, our game's now a huge success, and we're getting awards for it and everything, and this could have been yours, but it's not. And Ken just kind of going, yeah, that stuff happens. It's just a fun story, and I really just wanted to talk about it again because I think it's kind of a cool story here. So now we get to one of the two big stories that I wanted to talk about in here, because I've read two different accounts of this, and while they are largely the same, one of them lacks a few details that the other one does. Masters of Doom talks about this, but it doesn't really go into a lot of depth. And Rocket Jump, that one goes really, really into the weeds with this, and I think that's a more full account of what's going on. This one differs slightly from those accounts because it is just John's perspective and what John was seeing at the time. He goes more into what he was doing during the first year of Quake's development, where they were still really working on the engine, and the game design team couldn't really do a whole lot, and the art team was kind of stalled with what they could do because they didn't have everything that they needed. They didn't have a completed engine. They didn't have all of the assets in place. They didn't have all their tools done, or at least refined to the point where they were going to be very helpful when they were making this game. So John goes into just the different projects he had and some of the projects that kind of fell into his lap just because that's what happens when you're running things. John mentions that they have a business person at this time, but I think that John was that business person more often than not, or at least kind of doing that on the side while the major parts of the game were still being worked on. One thing that came to light with this, I didn't realize how involved John was with Raven Software's Heretic games, but it seems like he was doing a lot of work with those. There's also a lot of talk on just what was happening with the Quake engine and how it was being developed, and just the big differences between making a fully 3D engine and how that was different from the 2.5D engine that Doom was. It's kind of really insightful, to be honest, that you hear a game company talking about not just the problems that they had switching from 2D to 3D, but really going in depth about these are the problems we needed to solve. These are the things that we were building in order to set us up for the future. This is everything we were doing in order to really do this transition right. This is why it was taking so long. This is why, we were struggling with certain things. It doesn't go as in depth because John wasn't working on the Quake engine, but he tells us quite a bit about what he knew about the struggles of building it. John explains that a lot of what the team was doing around this time, or at least the design team and the art team, were building just R&D levels and creating textures and doing some other kind of like supporting projects to help the R&D team. He also explains how they were hiring more people to get things done. And yeah, stuff kind of happened. They still didn't have design documents, or they didn't have them written down in a way that you would probably see today. And this was kind of a theme for, id Software at this time. They did have the Doom Bible, and they, regardless of what John says in this, I think they used it in some ways, maybe not, referencing it all the time, but I can see parts of the Doom Bible that made it in, and maybe they just didn't realize it. But yeah, there's a huge chunk of it that was thrown out, but I think they did use some of it for inspiration at points. Maybe I'm wrong, but that was just the way I was reading it and the way that I kind of looked at the games while I went back and played them. I think they used elements of the Doom Bible, at least for Doom and for Doom 2. For Quake, they didn't have those documents, but they had sort of that overall vision that, at least when I read Rocket Jump, it didn't sound like everyone was on board with. And when I went back while I was reading this, John mentions certain things that are said by people that made me think that not everyone on the team was fully on board with it. Particularly talking about, Quake and his hammer and the different gameplay they were trying to do with Quake. So let's take a step back here. Quake was originally supposed to be an action RPG where your main character, Quake, has a hammer, and that's going to be the way that you attack enemies and whatnot. And you also have this little hell cube that is killing people as well, and you need to keep feeding it souls in order for it to stay happy. It's not that way when you play it now, but it's kind of interesting to hear about what Quake was supposed to be and what it turned out to be. We also hear two stories that seem to have gotten mixed up, and John does a pretty good job of sort of explaining what was going on. At least when I read Rocket Jump and when I read Masters of Doom, it felt like some of these stories were merged into one, and then when I read John's book, it felt like some of the stories that I read in the other two were sort of morphed together into a bunch of things, and then John does a pretty good job of sort of just explaining what happened. So there's a meeting, and Carmack accuses Romero of not working hard enough on Quake. He thinks he's focusing too much on other projects and not working too hard on the game. And John says that happened. There was also a report card that was sent out by Carmack where he basically graded every single employee and how hard he felt that they were working on Quake. And yeah, that's not very good for morale. And we'll talk about that later because it does come back into play. And also the meeting with Carmack and a lot of the other owners, that's brought up, and that's also not going to help out with morale at all. And then there's another one where John says this didn't happen. And that was Carmack tracking what Romero was doing while at work. And John says that was actually a different group of people that were working under like id's umbrella, like their development team umbrella. And that was a thing that Scott Host did while he was at Cygnus, when they were working on a different game. He was tracking everybody's like email activity and work activity. That story about Scott Host somehow got attributed to Carmack, and John basically says, no, that wasn't what happened. It's kind of an interesting part of this whole story where John is telling us stories about what did happen and trying to like dispel the stories that didn't take place. And I think that's kind of cool. There are a lot of stories about what happened just during the development of Quake. And yeah, I would encourage you to read Rocket Jump as well if you really want like a full picture of what everyone was doing, or at least a mostly full picture of what everyone was doing at the time. There is like one more thing that I really want to talk about, and that was kind of the breakup of id. Not really the breakup of id, but John Romero's exit from id Software. John left id right after Quake, basically. At the time, he talks about how his relationship with his friends was kind of frayed, and it would get repaired later on, but it just felt like they were both, specifically John Romero and John Carmack, were at an impasse where they could not bridge the gap. They were looking at things from two different perspectives. John Carmack just wanted to focus on one game at a time, focus on advancing their technology, and Romero, the way he writes it in here, wanted to grow the business. So that meant working on multiple projects at once, and at that time, back in the late 90s, they were just at odds and couldn't really figure out a way around it. And that led to John leaving the company and teaming up with Tom Hall to form Ion Storm, which was a whole nother can of worms. There are some other stories that John does not bring up that I've only read in Masters of Doom at this point, and that was where John Carmack and John Romero were kind of taking shots at each other, and I can't really verify if those are true, or I haven't found anything that would suggest that those were true. The more I read accounts from people who were actually at id or have mentioned things about id Software, the more I think Masters of Doom is not exactly as accurate as it probably could be. It's still a good book, but I think other projects and other books have sort of surpassed it at this point. I would either recommend reading John Romero's account in this book or reading Rocket Jump. I think those two are probably more accurate than Masters of Doom is. So this was kind of an odd section for me to write about. I feel like John was more detailed about his time at id than he was about his time at Ion Storm. I have a few theories about why, but none of them are really based on what was written in this book, and the other books that I've read about id, and some of the stuff I've read about just the id team at the time. I want to single out one thing that I find kind of odd here for a second, and that was the bitch ad. The advertisement that said John Romero is going to make you his bitch when they're trying to advertise Daikatana. John talks about this and how he didn't like the ad and he didn't want to do it. I've read about this in a few places, and I always wondered why it went out if John didn't like it. An answer is given in this book, and it ties into some of the larger issues at Ion Storm. When it came to the bitch ad, John trusted the marketing team because they had a bit of a track record dating back to id, and the ad was an attempt at aggressive marketing. However, it didn't get the desired effect. The ad turned some people off, and others started to get overly hyped about the game. John admits, hey, we're probably advertising this too early. The game's not really in a state where we can start advertising it. We don't have gameplay or anything like that. And yeah, this ad was not really the way to go. I remember seeing this ad when I was a kid, and I don't know if I had the desired effect that any of that Ion Storm wanted, because I saw it and I had no idea who John Romero was, and after reading the ad, I had no interest in finding out. When I first saw it, I had no idea what it was advertising. And even worse, I didn't have any interest in finding out what it was trying to tell me. At the time of this ad, I was 13 years old, and I didn't have access to the internet, and I really didn't know who made a lot of these video games. I never had a desire to go learn, aside from Sid Meier, and that was just because his name was on the goddamn games. I didn't know who John Romero was, I didn't know who John Carmack was, and at 13, I had better things to do than to find out. Unfortunately, I also didn't have access to the internet, so I would have had to have walked down to our public library and then tried to navigate a way to a website that would have told me who the hell these people were and what was going on. And honestly, I would have rather been playing in the woods, so I didn't bother to find out. Or I was probably beating Doom for the multiple time, or playing Warcraft, or something like that. Anyway, John doesn't really go into too much detail about his time at Ion Storm, and the simple answer is he wasn't there for everything that was going on, and it sounds like he heard a lot of stuff just secondhand. But the biggest thing I took away from his account was the entire company was just dysfunctional. You had a 50% owner stake with two people who probably should not have been 50% owners. And one of them just meddled in everything, and the other one was rather off-putting to the art department. We don't know a whole lot about what was going on, just because. And it does lead to something that John kind of reflects on, and that is that he didn't take action when he actually needed to. And this dates back really throughout the 90s. He was kind of prone to inaction when he was faced with a problem that really concerned other people. When running Ion Storm, he was in charge of a big team and had to deal with workplace problems. That wasn't his specialty at the time, especially since Todd Porter was messing with his team, and they didn't like it, and John wasn't effective a leader enough to say, hey, you need to stay away, and Todd didn't listen to him anyway, and that led to one of the teams leaving Ion Storm. So, yeah, it was just a lot of inaction, a lot of dysfunctional management, and nothing was really working too well at that company. John's inaction had a direct impact on Daikatana. It wasn't just John, though. Other people at the company contributed to the environment at Ion Storm. You can't really place the blame on one person for a work environment at that company. It's an entire group effort, but when an entire team quits en masse, you have a really big problem, like a bigger one than just one tyrannical owner meddling with all the projects that he isn't involved with. There is talk about Daikatana and what John was trying to do with the game, and it sounds pretty interesting what they were trying to do. However, it always took a backseat to just the dysfunction that was going on in Ion Storm. The problems with the game are discussed, and I think John tells us everything that he remembers about just that time. If I just described what the game was about, it would be something that I think most people would want to play. However, with all the problems in the company, the end product suffered quite a bit. This section of the book made me want to go and do more research on Ion Storm, because it seems like a really fascinating story of this company that put out 4 games. 2 of them were not good, and one is largely forgotten, and the other is Deus Ex, and it's awesome. So it just seems like there's more to this story than what John can tell us, and I'd really like to find out what that is. This is the part of the book that just kind of made me feel happy. This is an excellent part of this whole book where we follow John from one project to another. There are some sad moments that John writes about, but overall, the last few chapters of this book are wonderful. The story of making a game with his 9-year-old son, that's just heartwarming. It's so cool to see like his son had this idea for a game. He worked it all out, wrote up or drew out all the art assets that they were going to need, and John helped his son make this game. It was just really cool, especially since it got media coverage and everything. It's just a fun story, and it reminded me of doing different projects with my dad, like helping him build part of our deck, or building a birdhouse when we were younger, or something like that. It's just really cool to hear about stuff like this. And, it's just a really fun story, and it really picks you up after, all the crap with Ion Storm is talked about. There's also the story of John's archives in this. So, like many people that work in game development, especially in the 80s and 90s, it sounds like John just didn't throw anything away, and kept all of his design documents, his drawings, builds for different games, just kept all of that stuff and was kind of moving it around. So he had this huge collection of just stuff, and he was storing it in a secret room in one of his houses. Because, of course, John Romero has a secret room in his house that you need to walk up to a push wall and find an entrance to a hidden room where all of his archives are. Of course he would have that. Why would you even think that he wouldn't have that in his house? It just seemed to fit so wonderfully. But they had a flood, that house got destroyed, but his secret archives was still intact. And then he starts kind of donating some of that stuff off. And then he moves to Ireland and kind of reconnects with Adrian Carmack. There's more that happens in these stories, but those were kind of the big parts that I wanted to pull out. He then talks a lot about a game that he was working on called Black Room. So this was going to be a new first-person shooter, but it ended up getting canceled. It sounds really cool because he walks you through everything that happened with it, and Black Room gets talked about with 20 to 30 pages left. So I was kind of like, no, it can't end here, but unfortunately it ends shortly after Black Room is talked about. John talks about how they initially went with Kickstarter, and there weren't that many details with this, but the way he talks about it and kind of the way he admits they went to Kickstarter too early. They didn't have any gameplay or anything like that, and the Kickstarter ended up failing. They didn't get anywhere near the amount that they wanted. And then they started working on a demo for it. So they got some a gameplay demo that sort of explained what they wanted to do. They had a lot of their art assets in there. And they showed the gameplay demo to a bunch of publishers at a gaming convention. But unfortunately, because the Kickstarter was pulled down and it didn't work, the publishers saw that as an indication that people weren't really interested in it. So that didn't help them out very much. So yeah, it's somebody kind of navigating the indie game scene and not really doing it very well. Not because they didn't know, but just because Kickstarter at that time was still pretty new, and you didn't really know exactly what you were doing with it. It's kind of unfortunate that Black Room never got put out because it sounded really awesome, where you're going into like virtual reality and fixing problems within it, and there's this corrupted AI that's trying to stop you and it's sending monsters after you. That's pretty cool, and it just sounded really interesting. And I'm kind of glad that he talked about it here because I had heard rumor of it a while ago and then just never saw anything about it. I was really looking forward to this book, and it did not disappoint me at all. It's a wonderful account of John's life and just his history in game development. There's a lot in here, and I found many of John's game development stories to be just very interesting. I had a list of questions that I was hoping to get answers to in this book. And after reading other books about Doom, I was also looking forward to getting a first-hand account of what happened at id Software, as well as what happened at Ion Storm and really the development of Daikatana. I didn't get all of the answers I was looking for, but that's to be expected because John can only put as much of his story in here as he remembers, and he can only put as much of Ion Storm and Daikatana and id Software's history in here as he was there for. He can't tell us things that he doesn't know, and he can't really shed light on stuff that he wasn't there for. So, while I didn't get everything I was looking for out of this, what I did get was awesome. Doom Guy is a great book. It's one of the best books that I've read in 2023, and it's one of the best biographies that I've ever read. This is one of those books that I would highly recommend to anyone who wanted to learn more about video game development or video game history. Anyway, guys, that's going to wrap things up. Let me know what you think in the comments section below, and I will talk to you all later. Man, this was a long one. If you made it to the end here, I am so happy, and thank you very much for sticking this one through. I will talk to you all later. Bye.